Welcome to the Global Columbia Collaboratory. I'm Shannon Marquez, Dean for Undergraduate Global Engagement at Columbia University, and I'm so excited that you've joined us in the Collaboratory today for an important conversation on the impact of social media and disinformation on democratic institutions. One of the most pressing issues facing the world today, now more than ever, in today's globally connected world, undergraduate students need to be empowered as leaders to communicate cross-culturally and deal with complex global challenges, diversity, and change. The Global Columbia Collaboratory is a virtual exchange platform supported by Columbia College and the Center for Undergraduate Global Engagement in partnership with the Columbia Global Centers and Columbia World Projects that brings students, thought leaders, and educators together, promotes cross-cultural communication, and enhances skills and global competence to allow students to reflect, ideate, and collaborate to empower them to make a difference in the world. The global seminars, such as our seminar today, frame important global challenges as well as issues that must be tackled in achieving the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. And facilitated reflection activities provide a focused opportunity for students to share diverse perspectives on the global challenges presented in the seminars. Now, as these learnings and perspectives are shared across the collaboratory, the ideation activities support the creative process of generating and communicating new ideas, and students are encouraged to collaborate to support the further development of their ideas into projects that have the potential to address the most urgent challenges of our time. Now, over the past week, collaboratory students have been discussing how unreliable social media and false information is spreading rapidly and threatens our ability to achieve the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development in building strong institutions and peaceful, just, and inclusive societies as outlined by SDG number 16. Conflict, insecurity, weak institutions, fake news, and limited access to justice remain a great challenge around the world. So today, it is indeed an honor to have President Lee Bollinger step into the collaboratory and lead a robust discussion about this important global challenge, the impact of social media and disinformation on democratic institutions. Now, we're also thrilled to have over 190 students and nearly 5,000 participants that have been engaged in the collaboratory since it launched this past summer, including undergraduate students and observers from Columbia College, General Studies, and Columbia Engineering. And we have collaboratory students joining us today representing 23 countries around the world. Some of our students will ask questions to our panelists, and I encourage the global audience to also submit questions through the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen. Again, I want to welcome everyone to this Global Columbia Collaboratory Seminar, and I want to thank President Bollinger for his support and all of our partners and esteemed panelists. We are so pleased to be working directly with the Columbia Global Centers on these seminars. And at this time, I want to introduce Savwan Masri, Columbia University Executive Vice President for Global Centers and Global Development, who will introduce us to our panelists today. Savwan?
Thank you, Shannon. Thank you, and welcome everyone. And thank you, President Bollinger, for gracing us with this collaboratory session, and Emily Bell, Jamil Jaffer, and Alandra Nelson. This year's new collaboratory partnership between the Center for Undergraduate Global Engagement and the Columbia Global Centers has been nothing short of a standout. Over the summer and fall, we brought to the collaboratory students and our global audiences some exquisite discussions. Let me just name a couple of them. We had in June a discussion on supply chains in the context of the global pandemic crisis with CEPA Dean Mary Jano, the Financial Times Martin Wolf, Professor Ruth DeFries, a university professor at Columbia, and Ian Bremer of the Eurasia Group. My favorite webinar of the year, a collaboratory webinar, was the one on the self and other in the age of Corona that we did with the School of the Arts Dean Carol Becker, the New York Times Roger Cohen, and Pulitzer Award-winning author Hisham Matar. Another collaboratory webinar was the one on the false choice between economic and public health with Linda Fried, Dean of the Mailman School of Public Health at Columbia, economists Glenn Hubbard and Harrison Hong, and University Professor Wafa Sadr, a leading epidemiologist. And this fall, we had a session on elections and another just last week on food security. Today's event is the collaboratory's capstone event for the fall. We really could not have a better lineup for what promises to be a very rich and timely discussion of a topic that is of concern to all of us, and that is the intersection of democracy and especially First Amendment rights with social media platforms. What we are striving to achieve together, all of us on this webinar now, our students, faculty, and our global audience, has real-world implications now and into the future. During these pandemic days, we are mindful of the benefits afforded us by digital platforms, allowing us to assemble from far and wide, as we are today. And as we witness post-election unrest, we are conscious of the polarizing role social media has played. My main task today is to introduce to you our 4 panelists, an accomplished, insightful, and unusually thoughtful team who approach this topic through different lenses. Now, this is important. In a time when society feels increasingly fractured, and with the phrase information bubble so widely used and experienced, it is imperative that we be able to see the issues before us from different vantage points and to get the important information we need to participate in public life in a meaningful way. When I think about the impact of social media on our democracy, there are fundamental questions we must ask and answer. What are our civic duties? Do for-profit social media companies have these duties as well? Or is their job only to provide a venue for unfettered speech? Digital platforms spread information in algorithms that are much faster and broader than other forms of speech and are more vulnerable to influence by outside actors. This can have grave implications for our perceptions of free speech, as well as for democracy itself. What can and should we do? Addressing these questions for us and many more this morning and leading the discussion is the president of Columbia University, Lee Bollinger. President Bollinger became Columbia University's 19th president in 2002. He is the longest serving Ivy League president. Under his leadership, Columbia stands at the very top rank of great research universities, distinguished by comprehensive academic excellence, an innovative and sustainable approach to global engagement, and the institution's most ambitious campus expansion in over a century. President Bollinger is Columbia's first Seth Low Professor of the university and one of the nation's foremost First Amendment scholars. Jamil Jaffer is the Executive Director of the Knight First Amendment Institute here at Columbia. Previously the Director of the ACLU's Center for Democracy, Jamil has an abiding interest in issues of public discourse. He has litigated noteworthy cases relating to national security and civil liberties. Jamil's work led to the publication of both the Bush administration's torture memos and the Obama administration's drone memos. More recently, Jamil was successful in a lawsuit that prevented President Trump from blocking from his Twitter account users with whom he disagreed, arguing that a public official's social media accounts are among the most significant fora for the public to discuss government policy, and they must not become echo chambers. Our next panelist, Alandra Nelson, is the president of the Social Science Research Council and the Harold F. Linder Chair in the School of Social Science at the Institute for Advanced Study at Princeton. Alondra is a former colleague at Columbia, where she served as Dean of Social Science. She's a scholar of science and technology and social inequality. Her work challenges assumptions of universality in our experiences of technology. She has raised questions about the moral role of science and the ways new technologies are used in different populations. As part of her ongoing research, Alondra has looked at the use of social media, such as, say, cell phone video, in reporting in a democracy. She has also examined how polarization drives social media profit, noting that polarization can have a surprising lack of correlation, at least in certain demographics, with widespread consumption of social media. To round up our panel, we have Emily Bell, the founding director of the Tao Center for Digital Journalism at the Columbia Journalism School. Emily is a leading thinker, commentator, and strategist on digital journalism, having spent the bulk of her career at The Guardian in London, where she was an award-winning writer and editor-in-chief and director of digital content, making The Guardian a recognized pioneer in live blogging and multimedia formats and reporting. Emily is interested in policy issues in journalism and points out that because social media is the central conduit for official sources, it has an enormous influence on and in the news. Yet few newsrooms have made ethical concerns regarding the use of technology central to their design or operation. Instead, policy has been developing around individual journalists and their behavior. Emily sees this moment as an opportunity for legacy media outlets to think about how social media necessitates reform in journalism so that democracy is informed by strengthened journalistic integrity. With such a distinguished panel, we are certain to have an engaging morning here together. Thank you all for joining us. President Bollinger, I turn this over to you. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Safwan. Thank you, Shannon. Thanks to all my friends here, Alondra and Jamil and Emily. So let's get started. Most people, and I would share this view, think that the questions we're asking about disinformation, foreign interference, spread of hate speech on the media, the ways in which civic discourse are being conducted, are some of the most problematic issues we face of our time. It's not too hyperbolic to say that perhaps even democracy is at stake. So it's an incredibly important questions that we're wrestling with. It's also important to begin with a sense of history here. If one looks back, and it's only a very short period of time, a decade or so, in which the social media platforms and the explosion of the internet has happened. For the first period of this, we thought that it was the glory of democracy that we were facing. The Arab Spring was hailed as a time when social media made it possible for democratic revolutions to take place. And from a First Amendment perspective, everybody now had a platform in which to present their ideas, the realization of the dream of the marketplace of ideas. That was the first sort of period, 5-6 years. And now we've moved into this very gloomy period in which we fear for our own sakes because of what we see on the media. So important to think about where we have been and where we are now. There are really two problems when you look at social media platforms, and there's going to be a number of twos here, I'm afraid. One problem is that it is said that social media platforms censor too much. They have too much power because too much debate happens over these platforms, and they can now exclude people whose voices we think ought to be heard. The second problem is that they don't censor enough, and we have too many examples now of Russian interference in our civic discourse, easy spread of conspiracy theories and falsehoods and hate and the like. So one is too much censorship, the other criticism is not enough. Then you start to ask another set of questions. I think the first one is, what do we really know about the social media platforms and the speech that happens on it, the communications? Is this the cause, is the new technology the cause of all of this civic strife? Or is it the effect of it? And we need to look elsewhere for underlying roots. So what do we know and what do we need to know? And the second question then after that is, if it is really problematic, the new technology, then what can be done about it? Right away, one begins to think about what can the government do? Can we have laws? Can we have regulatory agencies? Can we have policies? And that invokes the First Amendment, because the entire last century has built up a sense of the First Amendment as not allowing the government to intervene in the realm of speech. And a lot of the speech that is talked about on social media platforms as problematic would be ordinarily protected by the First Amendment. So then a question is, what's the premise of the First Amendment? The premise is that if you allow speech to happen and bad speech occurs, good speech will counter it, and we should trust that, not the government. Well, is that basic premise no longer true? That's a fundamental question we have to face. And lastly, when you look at First Amendment jurisprudence, it's actually more complicated than we might think. And I just said, The last time we had a new technology of communication was in the late 20s and 30s with radio and television. And a lot of the fears that we now hear about civic discourse happening on social media platforms were also fears about radio and television, and for good reason. And the response of the society was to set up a regulatory regime, the FCC, for broadcasting, and that has existed up to this day. Heavy regulations, fairness doctrine, equal time provision, the sense of a new medium of technology that might be used for bad purposes was contained through government regulation, and the Supreme Court of the United States on a number of occasions upheld that. So is that the analogy for what should happen today? So these are massive questions, and we have people who have devoted a good part of their lives to thinking about them. And I'm really happy to begin with Alandra Nelson, who I think will take us into what do we know? In fact, where are the causes, where are the effects, and what do we need to know before we jump in and make decisions about what to do? Alandra?
Thank you, Lee, and greetings to everyone. Thank you, Shannon and Safwan, for the invitation. It's great to be reunited with my Columbia colleagues, Jamil and Emily. And you know, Lee, you really started us out with an amazingly concise kind of mapping of, I think, the issues that we face, and that also, I think, often feel quite overwhelming and unwieldy. And so thank you for sort of laying out so eloquently a kind of few of the lanes of conversation that we might pursue. And I'm particularly delighted to have this opportunity to speak not only with colleagues, but with students from all over the world about this issue, because it's one that has you know, quite planetary implications. So as Safwan mentioned, you know, I'm a sociologist of science and technology and inequality. So these are some issues I think about in my own work. And in addition, at the Social Science Research Council, where I lead the organization, we've had for the last few years a cluster of work under the banner of media, technology, and politics that supports research on issues of media and democracy broadly and tries to bring some empirical research to bear on some of the issues that President Bollinger raised. And so my comments will reflect some of the insights from this work that's been going on, as I said, for the last several years. So Safwan posed the question to us, you know, is social media undermining democracy? I think my answer as an academic, of course, is going to be yes and no. You know, yes, but in ways that are, I think, more complicated than I think are typically acknowledged. I think I first want to say that, you know, I sometimes worry that in our concern about what has been happening in the political cycle of the last sort of 4 to 6 years, that we risk being slightly too presentist, that some of the issues around democracy, the crisis of democracy we have faced before. There are things that are normative to American democracy: political violence, voter suppression, political polarization. And there's indeed a way of, I think, narrating an account of the history of the United States that is an enduring and ongoing struggle about who belongs in the polity, who should have the franchise, who's included, who's excluded. And those debates often are being navigated on a poll about, you know, marginalized, underrepresented minority, racialized populations in the United States in particular. So I think it's important to kind of plant that historical flag. I also want to suggest that social media technologies in and of themselves are not the problem, at least the only problem. That we want to resist a kind of technological determination, in part because the solutions that we will need and seek, some of them that President Bollinger gestured to, regulatory solutions, legislative solutions, are not technological solutions per se. And so if we are, you know, I think I want to resist technological determinism because it's incorrect, but also because it leads us down a road of technological solutions, which will not solve some of the problems that we face. I think the real issue is what people are doing on social media and how that exacerbates tensions, undermines democratic processes, and spreads hatred and disinformation. So I want to offer 3 or 4 examples of how we can say that social media itself is not the problem, and how we might sort of think with more nuance about the issue. So first, we know from data like the book Network Propaganda, 2008 book from Hal Roberts, Robert Ferris, and Yochai Binkler, that local TV remains the most used source for news for most Americans. Older forms of media, such as talk radio and cable news, are also implicated in the shift towards polarizing content. So it's not just the new media that is driving polarization. There are other forms of media as well. And it's this kind of larger ecology that I think that we might need to think more carefully about. And I think this insight reminds us that social media, as varied as they are indeed an ecology. They don't sit apart or are not disconnected from larger, broader media ecosystems that include not only television, but newspapers, radios, and the like. And so part of the challenge is understanding this ecosystem. And I think part of the challenge for researchers, of course, is how one the challenge of following conspiracy, misinformation, disinformation across these media forms. And indeed, part of what gives them oxygen and amplification is the traveling, the migration across different forms of media. So this being the case, it's important, and although methodologically difficult, as I suggested, to really situate studies of disinformation that are driving, in some ways, the crisis of democracy on social media within, research that travels across media ecosystems. We know that moreover, we know that there's a kind of asymmetry in the way that political media ecosystems work. It's quite sort of there's kind of tight nodes, kind of tight networks and ties on the right wing, anchored in television news like Fox and online news like Breitbart. And then there's a kind of wider interconnected ecosystem of the rest, which varies from kind of center-right conservative sites like the Wall Street Journal to quite liberal sites like the Daily Kos. And so there's, if one's kind of thinking, kind of imagining here social network mapping, there are kind of both wide kind of webbing networks and then highly kind of insular networks, and the kind of conservative right-wing space is quite kind of insular and self intermediated in that way. A second reason why it's not only social media or in the way that we think is that there's evidence that groups with the greatest polarization, so American adults over 65, are the least likely to use social media. So we still need more information and more research, but that suggests to us that there's a kind of disconnect between social media being the driver and those who are most likely to kind of circulate polarizing information. Third, related to my initial points about kind of the historical context, is that we know that trust in a broad range of institutions, and we know this from some of the Pew Research Center data, for example, has been declining for quite a long time, and has been declining, certainly before the internet, and certainly before the arrival of social media news. So we want to sort of keep in mind that we've got some other institutional problems around legitimacy of institutions, problems around populism and distrust of expertise that are related to the problems that I think that we too easily place in the sight of social media. And then lastly, I want to suggest also that there's quite a lot of evidence that it's not kind of bottom-up polarization and the democratization of the internet and of social media that's a driver, but that some of the kind of crisis of democracy is about polarization that's being driven by elite interests, and so that it's being used as a kind of lever for elite political interests. And as an example of this, we might think about the recent research that found that President Trump was one of the world's largest sources of COVID-19 misinformation, for example. So with that context in place, of course, it is the case that social media companies like Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube, make design decisions that prioritize engagement, and which in turn prioritizes profit. The power of these companies is extreme, it's unchecked, it's unaccountable, it's on the scale of large nation states. Their scale and scope are planetary, and the way that they do their work is really essential to their bottom lines. They want people to spend more time on their sites, which means that they can make more money and advertising revenue. As some scholars have reminded us, polarization is actually baked into the social media business model. And some researchers are finding that social media's information overload tends to amplify the effects of our already, cognitive biases, which are also sometimes called echo chambers. So with that caution, we also want to recognize, I think, as President Bollinger said, that social media can have a countervailing force, can be useful for, can have democratizing effects, allowing minority communities, subaltern groups to really critique power in ways that were not possible not long ago. I'm thinking in particular of the work by Sarah Jackson, Moya Bailey, and Brooke Foucault-Wells on online toxicity, and their recent book, #Activism. And this is some work that we were happy to support in its early stages at the SSRC. So that said, social media does seem to have some genuinely different qualities that make it amplify kind of polarization, and therefore make it a risk for a risk to democracy. Among these are the speed at which messages can spread, the relative lack of gatekeepers, and the kind of potential for mass participation happening very quickly, things going viral, people moving from one social media space to another very quickly, which both allow people to have their voices heard, but also allow voices of conspiracy, voices of polarization, and of racial animus to be heard as well. And then to wrap up, I think that we want to be clear about what we mean by social media and have a sense of what in the literature is called platform specificity. In the US, social media is often used as shorthand for Facebook and Twitter, which are the social media platforms that have the most penetration here. But there are a huge variety of social media platforms, and each with their own sets of challenges, of affordances, of possibilities, and also challenges for democracy. So we could think of, WeChat and Pinterest and other places in between, particularly when we look beyond the United States. And we also can look at these other platforms as a way of thinking what's possible as we think about solutions. So for example, early on, Pinterest took a quite proactive stance against COVID-19 misinformation and was willing to step in as a gatekeeper. And to President Bollinger's point, I think some would have was willing to act as a censor of speech. And the effect has been a squelching of misinformation in that space, but I think people can have debates about whether or not, that is a good thing for free speech or not. And then lastly, as a solution, as a scholar, one of the things we want to sort of think about as a potential solution is the ability to do research in this space. And that's been increasingly difficult. For example, on the empirical question of whether or not conservatives are disproportionately harmed or targeted by takedowns of their work, or they disproportionately censored, that's a hard question to answer, right? There's a kind of swiftly changing environment with people moving in between the sort of platform space, as I indicated before. Kevin Roos of the New York Times uses a tool partly made possible by Facebook called CrowdTangle that many journalists use, and has regularly highlighted kind of the top 10 stories of the day, which are with regards to misinformation that are often driven from conservative news sources. President Trump, as well as sites like Fox News and Ben Shapiro and the like. Facebook has replied to sort of countered or critiqued Roos's strategy by suggesting that what he's measuring is something called engagement, but not the kind of reach of what people see on their feeds, including the private posts. And this really, I think, raises I think, which is both the hurdle that we face and the challenge that we face, and also a possible solution. And I'll end here, which is that we can't answer as a citizenry and as a research community this question of the reach because the data is not available to study. There remain incredibly high hurdles. Some of the platform technology companies are indeed trying to litigate against researchers who would want to try to study what is happening in the space of social media. And so I think fundamentally, until we know more, we can't offer solutions that work. At the SSRC, we've been doing work in this space, even against this hurdle. So I asked the team with the global centers to share 2 open access books that are about social media and democracy and disinformation that I hope that people will avail themselves of. And, we also at the SSRC endeavored for almost 2 years to have a collaborative research project with some scholars at Stanford and Harvard with Facebook, making data available to researchers. And it was really, it was tough going in the end to get the data. So there's so much that we don't know, and some of what we do know is worrisome, but there's much more research that needs to be done.
Alondra, thank you very, very much for that. Let's turn to Jamil. Jamil, I think Alondra has brilliantly taken the question and exploded it into a kind of complexity that is something any serious person has to really take account of. So in one sense, it's to say, look, there are serious problems that we're talking about in the context of social media platforms, but they are rooted in a very, very, again, complex society and amplified in many ways, not just by social media platforms, their local TV and so on. And I sort of wonder, to what extent has the society taken this kind of free market libertarian perspective on everything, beginning with the 1980s and the Reagan administration, which was the beginning of the breakdown of broadcast regulations, so that what television, local TV does today, it could not have done then. And it only can do it today because of this kind of libertarian free market. That ends up in a world in which you have an incredible new technology of communication like the internet, and you have people like Facebook and Twitter and so on, despite the fact there are other ones, who say, look, we're the new New York Times, we're the new Washington Post, we're editors, we have the rights of the market. And those are for-profit corporations too. So the whole framing of this entire world is built around a premise of sort of openness, free market, et cetera. And the First Amendment buys into it. It reinforces. How do you see us confronting these questions in light of that large, both philosophical and practical framework?
Okay. Well, let me start by saying that I'm so glad to be part of this conversation, and thank you to Safwan and Shannon for inviting me to participate, and to Alondra and Emily, and to you, President Bollinger, for framing this discussion. And yeah, I think that Alondra is exactly right, that this is more complicated than is often acknowledged, that some of the problems that we tend to trace to social media may actually have other sources, or other sources as well. I think all of that is true. Let me just make let me make a couple sort of more general points, and then try to answer your question, Lee, about the First Amendment in particular. So the first thing I'd say is that this conversation is not a conversation about a kind of sideshow to democracy. Social media is where democracy is taking place now. And I think we pay lip service to that idea, but I just want to take 30 seconds to emphasize it, because if you think about where the conversations that are most important to self-government are taking place right now, it's in these conversations online and on Facebook and Twitter in particular. Government officials use those platforms as their principal means of communicating with their constituents now. Government agencies share information from their social media accounts. They ask the public for reactions to government policy ideas through their social media accounts. Ordinary citizens use social media to engage with their public officials and to engage with one another about public policy. Almost half of all political ad spending now is on Facebook or is on social media, and most of that is on Facebook. So this isn't a kind of sideshow to democracy. This is, social media, like it or not, is where the conversations that are most necessary to our democracy are taking place. So that's just about the importance of these questions that we're struggling to address. I think Alondra is exactly right that the kind of simplistic, we've gone from one simplistic narrative about social media to another simplistic narrative, and the first one was that social media is going to solve all the problems of our democracy, and the second one is that social media is the root of all the problems that plague our democracy. And the truth is that neither of those things is true. Social media has strengthened our democracy in a lot of different ways. It has given us new ways of sharing information, of exchanging ideas, of political organizing, of holding powerful actors to account for their decisions. And I think that those are hugely important changes. And it would be a mistake to think of social media in the way that we once thought of or still think of tobacco, for example. It's like as if it's only a plague. It may well be in some respects a plague, but it is not only a plague. It also offers us the opportunity for strengthening our democracy, and it already has strengthened our democracy in important ways. That said, I do think that there is no question that social media is distorting our politics in pretty profound ways. Because of a combination of network effects and anti-competitive practices, the largest social media platforms have now become gatekeepers to what used to be the public square. And that means they decide who can speak and what can be said, and most important, what gets heard. And because their business consists of selling ads, their algorithms tend to privilege speech that keeps users engaged. And that speech is often sensational speech or incendiary, or it's conspiratorial, or it's false, or some combination of all those things. And maybe worse than all of that, the structure of the platforms and the sophistication of micro-targeting means that all that speech is largely insulated from counter speech. And this goes to something that President Bollinger was saying earlier, this question of the First Amendment theory that in the long run, good ideas will prevail over bad. All of that turns on the assumption that it's possible to respond to bad ideas. But the way social media platforms are structured means that sometimes the bad ideas or the misinformation or the hate speech goes unresponded to. And I think that is a very significant source of the big pathologies of social media, filter bubbles and disinformation and polarization. I think those pathologies come in large part from the structure of social media platforms. I think that content moderation, which has been alluded to several times now, is important and maybe at the margins a partial solution to some of those problems, but I don't have a lot of faith that Facebook's decisions about what to take down from its platforms and what to leave from its platform and what to leave up, that those kinds of decisions are really going to make a dent in the pathologies I just mentioned. I think that much more important to those pathologies than the decision about what to leave up and what to take down are decisions about algorithmic prioritization. You know, what speech gets heard, and all of those decisions are made much less visibly by Facebook. They don't lead to the kinds of sensational news stories that takedowns sometimes do. But those algorithmic decisions are the ones that have a much more profound influence on public discourse. So what are the solutions to that if it's not content moderation? Let me just pause to say that entirely predictably, 30 seconds before I started speaking, Con Edison deployed all of its jackhammers to the street outside my window here. So I apologize if there's a lot of background noise. But I would say that there's the content moderation is not going to solve those problems. I don't think that there is any single regulatory intervention that will solve those problems. I think that those problems stem again from multiple features of the social media systems. I have a kind of wish list of regulatory interventions, and that wish list includes things like more aggressive enforcement of the antitrust laws, which would address the fact that this small number of actors has now become gatekeepers of public discourse. Another possible regulatory intervention would be interoperability mandates. So there, the idea would be allow other actors to build on top of the networks that the social media companies have built. And that would just create a diversity of platforms where we now have a kind of, very small number of actors in that space. That's another possible intervention. A third one would be stronger protections for online privacy, because all of this targeted advertising is built on pervasive surveillance that is made possible by the absence of privacy protections that most other countries have. So that's another possible intervention. I'll mention just one more because I think it's especially important. I think that we should have stronger protections for the journalists and researchers who are studying the social media platforms. Right now, those journalists and researchers are at the mercy of the platforms themselves, because the terms of service, the platform's terms of service, restrict journalists and researchers from using basic digital tools that are indispensable to any serious study of the platforms. And there's a federal statute as well that makes it, in some circumstances, a violation of the criminal law to violate the platform's terms of service, or at least that's the Justice Department's theory. And so you have the shadow of criminal liability hanging over the journalists and researchers who are doing some of the work that is most necessary right now. And I think that there are things that Congress could do to address each of those those issues that I just raised. Let me just say one last thing, which is at long last, Lee, a partial answer to your question. So how does the First Amendment fit in here? I worry that the First Amendment, because of the way it's been interpreted in over the last couple decades, will become a barrier to regulation that is necessary to protect the integrity and vitality of public discourse. The companies have become very, very good at framing their business models as speech protected by the First Amendment. And once you allow the companies to characterize their business practices as speech protected by the First Amendment, you make it almost impossible for Congress to impose regulation on that industry, which is, of course, the whole idea behind the company's legal strategy here. And so you have Google arguing, for example, that any regulation of its search engine should be viewed in the same way as the courts would view regulation of the New York Times decision to put an article on the front page rather than on page A17. Or you have, in Maine, there is an internet privacy law that internet service providers have challenged on the grounds that they say their decision to collect and sell the personal information of their users is speech protected by the First Amendment. And you may hear those arguments and think that those arguments are audacious and maybe even crazy. But the truth is, the companies have a lot of law on their side. The way that the Supreme Court has interpreted the First Amendment over the last, since the 1980s, really, but especially over the last decade or so, the companies' arguments have become, at the very least, plausible ones. And I see that as a real threat to our ability to address the set of problems that we're all talking about today. So let me leave it there. But that's at least, I hope, a partial answer to your question, Lee.
Lee, you need to unmute, please.
Yeah. So thank you, Jamil. It was far more than partial. It was comprehensive. So Emily, just to frame your comments, Alondra, like a great social scientist, says, be careful, don't oversimplify. See this social and human reality in its all its complexity, and it's serious, and we need to address it. But in order to do that, we have to understand how the society works. And Jamil, as a brilliant First Amendment lawyer and thinker, says yes, but we got to remember this new technology of communication is taking over our democratic discourse, and it is structured in ways that are counterproductive to good public discourse, the nature of the algorithms, the for-profit motive, and the like. And now we turn to you, and you have been steeped in the press for all of your professional life, at least I think all of it, and I have too, in a certain sense. So what I'm going to say, you will know intensely. You know that the press, the traditional press, the Guardian where you worked, the Washington Post where I was involved with, other newspapers, they could not see the internet coming. They could not imagine a world in which people would not go down every morning and pick up their newspaper and sit and have a cup of coffee or tea and understand the world. And lo and behold, it came by and it crushed them. The business model, as we know, of the traditional press is just gone. Some people, many people have celebrated that. The voices of authority that the great journalists and institutions claimed was out of proportion to what a democracy would want. But I think many of us have felt like something really important in the societies has been lost. A sense of judgment, of wisdom, of not allowing the extremes to dominate, et cetera, et cetera. A check on government that in fact individuals can never achieve, only institutions can achieve. So we're very worried about what has happened to the traditional press. One further comment, however, what we imagine as the ideal, the Walter Cronkite, the New York Times and the Washington Post, was really just about a half century in the making. Polarization in the press is more common over history than we think. And if you look at an 1890 article by the famous Louis Brandeis about establishing a right of privacy, their complaint was the trivialization and gossipy nature of the press. And if you look at the Hutchins Commission on Freedom of the Press in 1948, the most famous commission of that era, it was denouncing the press for not being serious about the news and not being fair and just. So what we think of as the great traditions of journalism and the press in shaping and controlling public debate may be a short period of time, may be an illusion. Nevertheless, I think many of us feel like something really important to civic discourse and democracy is being lost. How do you see it, Emily, coming from the journalism perspective?
Well, thanks, Lee. And it's not my desire to follow great scholars like Jamil and Alondra into this discussion, but I'm really grateful to Safwan and Shannon for organising such a fantastic opportunity to talk about these things. Is something being lost, Lee? It's a great question. I mean, we can count what's being lost. So if you look in America, what's being lost is largely local reporting outlets, local news. 50% reduction in newsroom staff in the past 15 years. Globally, what's being lost, I think, is, if you like, a sort of an opportunity for independent press to flourish in undemocratic societies, which was what we hoped, if you like, the democratizing power of the internet would bring. And we see, you know, last week there was a report out from Amnesty International documenting how, through Facebook's own transparency report, in fairness to Facebook, how the changing of speech laws in Vietnam had led to an 800% increase in Facebook removing the posts of activists and journalists. We see this in country after country where you have charismatic authoritarian governments who, incidentally, social media platforms were made for. I'm sure this was not the intention of the creators of Facebook, but their simple design just elevates individuals with emotive appeals above brands, above balanced sentiment. It is why authoritarians or people who can deploy a charismatic style of politics does really well. For the press, as I say, you know, let's look at it from the US perspective to start off with. So what we've seen is, I think, as you say, a kind of a hope in about like 2005 that some of the really corrosive practices of corporate media would actually be broken apart by the advent of a more democratized set of platforms. You know, if you're a woman, if you're a person of color, you often would see, you know, through the 70s and 80s when I was consuming a lot of press, yourself simply not reflected in the stories. You never appeared, and when you did appear, you were grossly misrepresented. When I entered a newsroom, and I only really ever worked in what we would call as the most liberal of liberal newsrooms, you also just didn't see many people like yourself. You know, I'm a white, middle-aged, Oxford-educated woman. I was the diversity candidate for a long time in the newsrooms I was in. That's a very unideal situation to be in. So we had this flourishing for about 10 years, or maybe kind of more like 5 years, of genuinely new models and new outlets and new voices. And I think some of that has stuck, and some of it is challenging established press organizations. So I think that's, you know, to Alondra's point about, you know, there are benefits and there is a history here that we shouldn't ignore. That's one thing. But when you're just losing professional journalists from the field at the rate that you're losing from at the moment, there is something wrong. And you know, it is really the recession of advertising from supporting free media, which is underneath that. The targeting efficiencies, particularly of Google and Facebook, particularly on mobile phones, effectively means that as a media business, you simply can't really replicate their business model in a way that will allow you to make the same kind of money that you would make from, you know, advertising at the New York Times, or even, you know, as we enter this new sort of period of video on mobile, we'll probably see the big broadcast networks going the same way as papers. What it does mean is that if you have scale, so if you can replicate scale, you will do pretty well. Or if you have a rich owner who can invest in digital technologies like Jeff Bezos at the Washington Post, you'll do pretty well. But when you kick out the struts under local news, you lose the foundation for all journalism. You know, those reporters who go to school boards, who diligently write up what's happening at the State House, they're building a public record and they're building an accountability mechanism, which actually feeds local TV. So again, you know, kind of just referencing, where do people get their news? If they get it from local TV, local radio, the chances are in the past that reporting was done by a local newspaper at the outset, or a local news website. You lose more than that. So we know from research that when town or a city loses local journalism, that certain measures change. So people stay in office for longer, the public salaries are higher, the kind of just measures of accountability show that there is a sort of a move towards a less healthy democratic environment. So we know that it
Emily?
matters. Yeah.
Emily, could I just ask for you to pause, only pause, because Alondra has to leave at 10:30. And Alondra, do you have any sort of closing comments you want to make before you have to go?
Also, maybe Alondra, I mean, there's a question I have for you, so you may consider it in some of your closing remarks. I mean, you've worked a lot on stuff related to universality, to how technology and social media plays out in different populations. You've observed that while the Black community has historically been the most harmed by technology, it's also been the most innovative. Could you speak to this maybe a little bit and help inform how social media perhaps can be used productively, effectively, for a healthier democracy of inclusion? I mean, could you speak to that demographic in particular, if you don't mind?
Sure, I'll speak briefly. Sorry to interrupt you, Emily.
That's okay, no worries.
We'll come back, I'm sorry. But thank you for the opportunity to say a little bit more. What do we know? I mean, I think, Black Lives Matter is such an interesting case study for talking about this. Really a social movement, Occupy a little bit as well, but, social movements in the United States very much born out of the social media space and really leveraging that space to do, as Emily was saying, to give voice to communities that didn't typically have voice at the political table. And, I think, Lee, I think early on mentioned the kind of marketplace of ideas, and there has been this kind of ideology, this assumption that everyone could sit in the marketplace or everyone could come to the table. And of course, that's never been true. And so the big sort of affordance of social media is that it allows, activists, African-American activists and others to really have a seat at the table, to be in the marketplace of ideas in a real kind of fulsome way that didn't exist before. But those are, but the communities are vulnerable to Twitter accounts being shut off, to the kinds of gatekeeping that Jamil suggested. So it's a very, sort of paradoxical space of both of liberty until someone decides they're going to shut it off. And in some cases, it's literally just someone deciding, that one person deciding to shut it off. And I mean, that is, that's an extraordinary, I think, challenge for social movements. And then, Jamil mentioned this a little bit, then you have the sort of larger problem of just technological surveillance more broadly, to which communities of color are disproportionately subject. And so to the extent that social media is trying to, and this is what I meant also a little bit about the technological determinism piece early on, to the extent that technology companies are saying, well, content moderation is impossible, you can't ever put enough bodies to the problem, we're going to use AI. And these automated systems that build into them biases that disproportionately affect communities of color and are part of these larger ecologies, so that even if a content moderation AI itself is not, itself biased in certain ways, with regards to facial recognition and these sorts of things, it is amplifying a whole ecosystem of surveillance that's interoperable with other systems. So this is, moving in the space from Google to Palantir, moving in the space from political mobilization to the criminal justice system. And it is, so the sort of danger here is scalar, even if the opportunities for what I think is often very kind of brave and courageous activism is also scaled up as well.
Alondra, thank you very much. Anything more?
Thank you, Lee. No, thank you. Such a pleasure. Delight to see everyone. And thank you for all the good work that you're all doing. Bye-bye.
Likewise, Alondra, thank you.
Thank you, Alondra.
So Emily, back to you. When I interrupted, you were making this powerful case with the facts that the local media has just been decimated. And that has very serious consequences for local democracy. You can't find out about the school board, you can't find out about City Hall and so on. So please continue on.
Yeah, and actually, Alondra, her comments just prompted me to carry that thought one step further, which is, when you see then what replaces, so the next thing is what replaces the systems that we had, what replaces the old-fashioned newsroom in the town square. Facebook groups have been a very powerful convening mechanism. And on the plus side of the ledger, again, they allow people to organize in ways that was not really allowed by the press. But they carry no accountability with them. They also allow the flourishing of things like QAnon. And if we come back to this idea of the marketplace of ideas, in economics, Gresham's law, which I'm always quoting to my students, says in an unregulated financial market, bad money will always drive out good. Because the tactics deployed by bad actors and the lack of ethical frameworks always means that they can exploit those systems more efficiently than people with ethical considerations. And we have to think about these platforms as operating on a very similar basis of real-time trading to the kinds of systems that underpin the financial system. So what we have in speech is exactly what we have in the financial markets, and it's not regulated in any sense. And what we see is that the bad speech, if you like, just routinely drives out the good. And at local level, you see that the conspiracy theorists, the louder voices, the racists, tend to have a chilling effect on the more contemplative, quieter, more vulnerable voices. You also see developments now where platforms will have much closer relationships with law enforcement at local level without the intervention of any journalists at all, without any accountability mechanisms within them. And what moves into that vacuum, I think, is where we're focusing a lot of our research at the moment. So we've been researching these networks of apparently news organizations that are in fact vehicles for largely right-wing lobbying organizations, though it's occurring across the spectrum. Facebook makes it almost impossible to interrogate the roots and sources of these stories and news. We've actually worked with Facebook's policy people on trying to identify ways in which they could perhaps kind of act against these networks themselves. But even when they develop policy against it, they don't really implement it. So my worry is that it's not just that we're losing something, it's that we are when you don't have advertising to support free media, then money that does support free media comes from political or commercial sources, which are really easy to obscure in this ecosystem. And that's where you start to lose your bearings on reality. So some of these systems that we were looking at over the course of 2020 were putting out literally hundreds of thousands of headlines with the words voter fraud in. Often the pieces made not much sense. They were of minor interest. They didn't employ the judgment or the curation that you would expect on a rational news story. And they weren't really meant to be read. They were just meant to wash through this idea that voter fraud was a problem. Our researchers have to spend a lot of time trying to excavate what happened to those headlines, because it's very difficult to get that data out of the platforms themselves. So I think that whilst we see really some flourishing at the, if you like, the larger end of journalism, my own organisation, The Guardian, pre-internet was the 7th largest national newspaper in the UK. Now it has an international presence, and it can support the kind of journalism globally that we had ambitions to do back then, but we're really not scaled to do. The Atlantic has been doing amazing work during the pandemic. The Guardian and the Atlantic are not part of the free market of the press. We're protected by trust. They're owned by a very wealthy person, Green Pal Jobs. So I think that this problem of how do we restore some kind of consistency and equity into our news environment is a really significant one. And to Jamil's point, you can't separate social media from legacy media. They are now all the same thing. Platforms have such a profound effect on the business models and the shape of journalism and the way it spreads and the way it influences audiences. And just to sort of go back to the excellent book, Network Propaganda, that Alondra mentioned, Jocko Benkler updated that research in 2020, and he redrew the map of these right-wing influence, hubs of influence. And the main difference between 2016 and 2020 was that Donald Trump's Twitter feed was as large a node as the whole of Fox News. And the only reason that his Facebook page was absent from it is because we can't get the data, we can't get the adequate data from Facebook to represent it. So, you know, what can we do about this? I mean, there's been a council of despair around local journalism for a long time, but I feel quite hopeful at the moment that there is now certainly the political will and lots of policy thinking about, is this time to rethink how we build institutions around the provision of civic and public media in the United States? Are there networks of interest that can support that? My slight worry about this is that two of the principal suppliers of funding to local news at the moment are Facebook and Google, and I feel that they're shaping an agenda around the press, which is not really how we want to be making our decisions about democratic institutions. And I think in communications and speech, that's really important, that yes, these are unignorable presences, but they're also becoming sort of juggernauts for policy as well. So I think we have a narrow window in which to say, we can't solve all of this by regulating or reforming social media platforms, but we can start to look at the whole system, and we can certainly start to look at what we want from civic reporting, civic media at the bottom end of the news chain, and how we can rebuild that. And I think, you know, it's very important that we have the right kind of values and legibility from the platforms to allow that to happen. So, you know, kind of so it's not just one thing. But I think, you know, we should expect platforms, I think, to at least provide some of the funding for this, not necessarily on their own terms, but on, you know, our terms. And I think that we need to think about their platforms and policies as part of this, as opposed to, you know, a separate vessel or a wrapping for what we consider to be, you know, real media.
Right. So before Safwan going on, because we have Emily here, and Emily comes from the British European tradition as well, it's important to note that Europe is coming at all of this from a very different kind of framework, much more suspicious of the claims of the technology companies to be free, a different sense of freedom of the press in those countries, not a full commitment to free speech that the United States has, hate speech, false speech, etc., not protected to the same degree as in the United States, and a very large tradition of public support of media and public broadcasting in particular as a means of controlling discussion of public issues. All that correct?
Yes, correct.
Yeah.
Yes.
Safwan?
Thank you all very, very, very much. We have a large number of questions on the Q&A from the global audience. But before we do that, we have questions from students, from collaboratory students, two in particular. So if you'll allow me, I'm going to read their questions, and President Bollinger, you decide how and who is going to address them. So the first one is from Natalie Tack, who is a Columbia College psychology major. She is member of the class of 2023. She is in New York currently, and her questions are: one, given that the nature of information on the internet has changed so that it is competing for our attention, do you think that there's a danger of corporations paying to influence our beliefs without our knowledge? I mean, this to some extent has been addressed. And his second question is, because of the abundance of information online, closed online belief groups like conspiracy theory groups can form, and people can become deeply entrenched in the wrong ideas. How do you think we can best combat this issue? So if we can handle Natalie's question, and then I'll ask questions from Priya.
Safwan, let's take two more questions,
Okay,
and then we'll discuss them together, and people will have more sense of
sure.
what's out there.
So I have another question from a student. Priya Dutt is in Brooklyn, and they are a student at the Mailman School of Public Health. And Priya's question is, the last few years have made it clear that we need to create responsible and free social media spaces to counteract the rise of infodemics, polarization, and the resulting negative mental health effects. How can we create such spaces online, and who is responsible for doing so? So these are the questions from the students. If we can deal with those, and then we can go to a couple of questions from the wider audience.
Okay, so go ahead, Jamil. Questions of corporate influence because of use of the internet, combating conspiracy theories, and making spaces open for speech.
Sure. So let me start with Priya's question about creating alternative spaces, if that's the right way to paraphrase the question. We have spoken mostly today about how to fix the existing social media platforms, which I think is a hugely important question. But another possibility here is to create structures that are parallel to and provide alternatives to the existing structures. And actually at the Knight Institute right now, we have one of our visiting scholars is Ethan Zuckerman, who has done a lot of work on digital public infrastructure and coming up with alternative models for public discourse, essentially different technologies that people can use as alternatives to Facebook or Twitter or TikTok or whatever. And I think that in the United States, that this seems like a more radical proposal than it does in many other places. But it seems to me like an important part of the appropriate collective response here. Our collective response has to be, in part, regulate the platforms, figure out what kinds of legal frameworks we need to address the challenges that the existing platforms are presenting. But another part of the solution is let's create some alternatives to what already exists. On the question about privacy and surveillance and the collection, the concentration of all this, or the aggregation of all this information in the hands of private corporations that can then influence us invisibly, I think that's a really important point. We don't have, I mentioned this earlier, we don't have the kinds of privacy protections here in the United States that citizens of other democracies take for granted. And one consequence is that these private corporations are accumulating huge databases of information on activity that is protected by the First Amendment. So, Facebook knows which web pages you visited and how long you spent on each one, which New York Times articles you clicked on and whether you scrolled down all the way, really granular information about your exercise of the freedoms of inquiry and association and speech. And I think there are a lot of different questions here. One of them is, what are the long run implications likely to be of the collection of all that information on First Amendment activity? Will people be willing to engage in the same kinds of, will people be willing to run searches on Google for terms that are in one sense or another controversial, if it really registers with them that all this information is being collected and retained indefinitely without restriction, really? So one question is about that chilling effect, or that possible chilling effect of all this surveillance on First Amendment activity. But then another is just about the integrity of the political process. That just where are the messages that we are seeing online coming from, and what's motivating them, who's behind them? All of that is pretty invisible right now. And I mentioned this earlier, but the absence or the dearth of counter speech, that is in part a result of the invisibility of micro-targeting. An advertiser on one of these platforms can select a very small community and target a message at that particular community. The message could be, full of disinformation, and nobody knows that message has been delivered or to whom it's been delivered, and so nobody knows that it needs to be responded to. And I think that is that's a really big problem. And I gave a long list of possible regulatory interventions, but some solution to that problem would be at the top of my list.
Emily?
Yeah, I would just echo that. I would probably go to a slightly more extreme European style end of this and say, we really need to assess whether or not targeted advertising, which is the other end of the data privacy debate, should be allowed. And should it be allowed for political advertising? It's just a stunning fact when you think that a political campaign now in a big country will run tens of millions of advertising, of individual ads, because it is doing, as Jamil says, it's targeting people almost at an individual level with subtle differences. And AI technology has made that more and more possible. So I think sort of that is part of it that we absolutely have to look at. Just sort of looking at going back to the question about how do we build these alternative spaces, I think once you start to change the model and perhaps regulate the model of targeted advertising, you do open up the possibility that people can compete with different types of platforms. So back to Jamil's point, one of the things is that if whoever owns the most data in this world wins. It's very difficult to compete against any of these platforms or to chisel out alternative spaces and make them sustainable or viable. So that we haven't talked about antitrust here. We know that there's a lot of activity and thinking about that, and currently sort of Google and Facebook are both, I think, facing potential antitrust challenges. I think that might be actually quite an important element in this, which is it is just very difficult to compete with any of these at the moment. So I think it's a combination of that. I would just go back to saying it's within the power of the platforms to dial up speech or information which has more integrity to it. We saw them do this after the 2020 election, where they changed the algorithm on Facebook to promote organizations and content which came from more credible sources. And the list that Alondra talked about, that Kevin Roos at the New York Times collects, completely changed from charismatic right-wing talk show hosts to quite boring articles from the New York Times and CNN as things that were actually being promoted into people's feeds. And Facebook has the ability to do that. It just chooses not to use it most of the time. The question that said, are we being influenced by sources that we can't recognize? Absolutely. This is what a large part of our research is currently about, which is things that use the livery and credibility of news, present things as news, but which have hidden financial roots behind them. And a large part of that could be solved very quickly by Facebook, Google opening up directories of what these companies are, demanding a little bit more proof of who they are and who's backing them before it labels them as news sources, which incidentally they are labeled on these platforms as news sources.
Safwan?
Thank you. So going to the audience questions, I'm going to try to group a few questions into two categories. I mean, there's a number of people who are asking about sort of cross-border use of technologies and an impact that governments have on one another. So Dermot Foley, for example, asks about the responsibility that the United States government may have in being open and transparent about its efforts in using technologies to sway judgment in its favor throughout the world. Sam Dagher, who is an alum in Beirut and is a journalist, asks, in the context of, you mentioned President Bollinger of the Arab Spring, to what extent do you think the toxicity and polarization in social media can be traced back to amplified presence of certain governments? And he mentions Russia, China, Iran, Saudi Arabia, and Turkey. And of course, the Trump phenomenon. Nicola Rubino also asked about disinformation distributed by modern media that is not sponsored by for-profit organizations, but rather by nation states who provide their populations with the majority of available information to their inhabitants. So you've got those sort of global issues, and then a number of other people, John Stowe, Jean Golden, Seifi Kenan, ask about the role of education. What role does a university, for example, have in ensuring that the foundations, the pillars of freedom of expression are observed, that First Amendment rights are adhered to? Question also about social media becoming tools of elites, if you will, in the United States, with a particular focus by that question on what's referred to as the Wuhan virus. And I know that this is something, President Bollinger, you have particularly thought quite a bit about and written about. So I'm not sure if all of this comes together coherently and cohesively, but you get the idea.
Yeah, of course, it all comes together. So it's really good to have this push into the global role, because our focus has been really about, does this undermine democracy in the United States? But it was also came up, and I think it was Emily who raised it, that there is a global communication system now. There's always been global communication. I mean, but this is beyond anything the world has ever seen. Instantaneous, almost pervasive communication around the world. It is also the case that we have enormous collective problems to solve around the world. So climate change is a US issue, but it's a global issue, and we know that. And it will never be dealt with unless there is a global consensus. It's a collective action problem of the highest order. We see this now with our rights and with the internet being impacted by what other countries do with the internet. So the Europeans, just to go to them, want to have a right of privacy that can force social media platforms and Google and so on to not list certain things. Do we want to have the same rules as Europe on being able to close off information because of a right of privacy? Probably not. That's inconsistent with our traditions, and yet their rules will impact us. Censorship abroad is going to lead these companies to shut down things that will affect the people in those countries, but it will also affect us. On the other hand, we also hear constantly of Russian disinformation campaigns in the United States. And there are laws in the United States that forbid foreign countries from interfering in our domestic elections. That makes sense to me. But it's also the case that we want to know what people around the world are thinking. And so we can't just shut off foreign interference, foreign speech on the grounds that it, quote, interferes with our elections. And so there are enormous tensions and really important questions about how do you structure a global communication system, given the traditions about free speech, free press that we have in the United States. Emily, do you want to speak about that as well?
Well, I mean, I think that, I was just thinking about the German example that Alondra mentioned, and one of the outcomes of some speech laws in Germany that absolutely wouldn't be tolerated in the United States was that they mandated Facebook to have 3,000 content moderators who spoke German in Germany to address very specific cultural issues around the far right and hate speech, which, you know, for good historical reasons, Germany has outlawed for many years. And I thought it's interesting when you look at the different measures that are taken by different countries around the world to tackle this. You know, it comes back to Jamil's point about, you know, we don't have to think about one system working for everybody. You know, actually the way forward is to think there are there's cultural context which needs preserving. There are sensitivities in different markets. I noticed a student asking the question about Myanmar and saying, how did it happen that Facebook allowed the military to manipulate social media in Myanmar to result in the genocide of Rohingya? And the answer is because it had no knowledge of what it was doing there. It had nobody who spoke the native language. It had no guardrails on the ground there. It didn't. So it could be that actually in operating a global system, we want certain standards for companies who are operating internationally to establish before they go into those markets. You know, maybe you should not be able to operate a social platform in a market where you haven't invested in moderators or in officers who speak the language. You know, that you have to demonstrate that before you actually go into a market. I don't think this is an easy problem at all, but I think that you're absolutely right, Lee, that, you know, it's an international problem. And I think America could actually start to think about how it regulates in the US in a way that fosters and promotes democracy elsewhere. And that, again, is something that it's manifestly failed in. It's actually very, very easy for Facebook to be a tool of oppression simply by aligning itself with the laws of the countries that it operates in.
Yeah, thanks, Emily. And Jamil?
You know, just on that last point, so I do think that you know, we're so connected now to the rest of the world. You can't solve these problems in one country. It does require a global effort. But one little piece of this is, are there ways in which we could change our own policies to at least open up some space more space for journalists and human rights advocates, political dissidents in other countries? One of the cases that we've been litigating at the Knight Institute is a challenge to the State Department's relatively new rule that requires millions of visa applicants every year to register their social media handles with the State Department. And there are countless political dissidents in other countries who are able to participate in political discussions on social media only because they use pseudonyms. They're not using their real names. And the requirement that, you know, in order to get a US visa, you have to register your social media handle with the State Department is at the very least a deterrent to those people applying for visas to come to the United States. And, you know, I do worry that, you know, when people do share that kind of information with the State Department, we don't have real, we don't have meaningful restrictions in place that prevent the State Department from sharing that same information with other countries. And so, you know, with the examples that, you know, Saudi Arabia has unfortunately given us over the last few years, you know, we know what happens or what can happen to political dissidents when they're able to track those dissidents down and attribute their political speech to them. And I think we have a responsibility here in the United States to ensure that we don't facilitate the you know, really terrible human rights practices of you know, of some regimes. And there are small changes we could make to our own laws that would you know, strengthen the position of political dissidents abroad, human rights activists abroad, journalists abroad. And, you know, it seems like we should start there.
So we're out of time, and there's no point in trying to summarize all of this, Safwan and Shannon, I'm afraid. What I would say is that for me, this is why one wants to be in a university. I mean, you have fantastic people who are thinking about this from different disciplinary angles. incredibly important problems, but also extremely complex. And the job of a university is to explore that complexity of great questions, not to avoid giving answers and not to avoid doing something. But when things are complex, they're complex, and it's important to know them. And a session like that today is revealing of that and the greatness of our universities. Thank you to Safwan. Thank you, Shannon, for setting this up and inviting us all to join.
Yes, and we have truly enjoyed this engaging discussion about one of the most pressing concerns in the world today, the impact of social media and disinformation on democratic institutions. As President Bollinger said, it's really hard to summarize what we've discussed. We've talked about everything from polarization being driven by elite interests, the disinformation about COVID-19 and climate change that spread around the world, the potential for mass participation in social media when disinformation goes viral, how government officials use social media accounts to communicate, censorship, and our rights in the US, and how they're impacted by what other countries are doing with social media. This was the third and final seminar of the Global Columbia Collaboratory, a virtual exchange platform that brings Columbia students, thought leaders, and educators from around the globe together to reflect, ideate, and collaborate to make an impact. A special reminder to undergraduate students that we already have close to nearly 100 applications for the spring 2021 program, and we're excited to have you join us in the collaboratory next semester. You can learn more about this on our website at uge.columbia.edu. We're looking forward to the lineup of collaboratory seminars next semester, where we'll continue very important conversations about the most pressing challenges facing the world today. So keep an eye out for the announcements about next semester seminars. Thanks again to all of our panelists for joining us today, Alandra Nelson, Emily Bell, Jamil Jaffer, and our moderator, President Lee Bollinger. Many thanks to the team at the Columbia Global Centers, Columbia World Projects, Columbia College, and the Center for Undergraduate Global Engagement. And of course, we want to extend a very special thank you to our amazing collaboratory students and partners and participants from around the world. A reminder that a link to a recording of the full webinar will be sent to everyone who registered. And for others, you'll be able to find it on our website. Thank you and be well.
Thank you, Shannon. And let me also recognize Karen Poniaczek and Chris Molinari from the Santiago Columbia Global Center for having conceived of this webinar. Thank you, Shannon, President Bollinger, Emily, Jamil, and Alondra.
Thanks very much.